Welcome, everyone, to the LUGPA Virtual Crossfire Series on UroCareLive. I'm Neil Shore, Medical Director at Carolina Urology Research Center. Today's program is entitled Private Equity, Fad or Future. We hope to bring you an interactive, and by that I mean, please type in any questions that you have. We want to get an opportunity to this really fantastic panel to answer your questions, and want to engage in that discussion that will provide value to you and your practice. Today's program is part of a larger LUGPA Crossfire series with programs throughout the year that cover a number of clinical and practice and administrative and management topics important to LUGPA members. Of note, we did a similar program to this about 4 years ago, and that just seems like almost, a decade ago. So much has evolved. We had different faculty then. We can only accommodate about 4 person on this program. So we'll certainly, if others want to come on and do a discussion such as this, we want to accommodate you. I'd like to thank Bayer and Exact Sciences and UroGen for their support for this series in 2020. And for that matter, throughout the year, LUGPA is incredibly honored and proud to have our industry sponsorship. This has been a key aspect of LUGPA's growth throughout our 12, now going into our 13th year. So today, I'm so happy and honored to be joined by Jonathan Henderson. Jonathan is the president of LUGPA, and he is the CEO of Regional Urology. His group was an original organizing group when LUGPA started. Dr. Deepak Kapoor, Deek, was an original founding member on the board of LUGPA, a past president of LUGPA, and he is the current and for many years has been the chair of the LUGPA Health Policy, and also is the chairman and chief ecosystem officer at Solaris Health Holdings. And finally, we have Scott Davis. Scott is the CEO of Arkansas Urology. Arkansas Urology was one of the first organizing members of LUGPA, and Scott is on the board of directors of LUGPA. So, gentlemen, this is fantastic to have you here. We're good friends. We've known each other a long time, and we're great colleagues. You three represent, some of the really cutting-edge knowledge of this topic, and so that's why I think this is so important. Activities on this program are interactive. It allows us to take your questions in real time, as I mentioned a little while ago. So please ask your questions, because I know we have some incredibly knowledgeable and smart folks in the audience. So with that, let me continue to move forward. Here are our speakers. They really, I introduced them, but I think everybody knows them extremely well. And with that, let me hand it over to Dr. Kapoor, who will make the presentation for thinking about and learning about private equity models.
Thank you, Neil. And again, I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak to the broader LUGPA community. And I'm sorry, am I muted? Can you hear?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the broader LUGPA community on this. We are facing unprecedented challenges. Obviously, COVID has greatly amplified that, but these challenges existed before that. And I'm extremely gratified and honored to be on a panel with Scott Davis, who I admire highly, and of course, my very dear friend and long-term compadre, Jonathan Henderson, as well as you. So thank you very much. I want, just for relevant disclosures, for conflict of interest, I am the Chief Ecosystem Officer and Chairman of the Board of Solaris Health Holdings, LLC, which is a private equity-backed urology venture. And I would not be fair to not acknowledge Dr. Gary Kirsch, my partner in Solaris, and Dr. Josh Peck, my Chief Development Officer, who worked with me on the development of the slides. So with that, let me go ahead and jump right in. So the first question is, why concern ourselves? Many of us feel that our practices are doing pretty well, that as we rebounded from COVID, second wave notwithstanding, that what is the necessity for us to do anything? And as we all know, what's going on in practice is kind of bewildering. And so we see our brothers in arms joining hospital employment, forming multi-specialty groups. Some people are saying to do nothing, but realize do nothing actually is an active decision at this point in time. And of course, there's a number of folks, our practice included, that have gone the route of private equity. Evaluating these options can really be very challenging for practices because very often, even the people that are advising us have certain conflict of interest. So, for example, if you retain a banker, most of them are very competent and really represent the group's interests extremely well. But since there may be a closing benefit for them, there is a perceived conflict that exists. So it really behooves all of us to become very educated on this so that we're able to speak well to our advisors so we understand exactly what these options are. And importantly, again, I can't emphasize enough that if you choose to not do anything, that in and of itself is an active choice. So again, this side is something that we're all aware of. I'm not going to spend much time on it. We know about the consolidation, hospitals, multi-specialty groups, single specialty groups, such as ours. We know about the increasing complexity of reimbursement, MIPS, APM, value-based contracting, which has not really met its full potential. We know about these demonstration projects. We just recently saw the Most Favored Nation drug proposal come out. We have the radiation oncology demonstration project, which has been deferred through July. These changes are really bewildering. But these business changes aren't the only changes that we have. You know, the changes within our own practices are equally bewildering. Urology is a field, as we all know, that's very highly technical, extremely entrepreneurial. A lot of medical innovations in urology occur from the bottom up as opposed to from the top down. So as a consequence, it's difficult even for us as practitioners to keep abreast of all the latest medical surgical changes. Neil, Dr. Shore has been at the forefront of some of the medical changes. And, I don't have the wherewithal to be an expert on PARP inhibitors and robotic therapy and the latest developments in urinary incontinence and urinary NGS, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a need for subspecialization, and that subspecialization requires scale. And that scale, this term, is one that you're going to hear a lot during my portion of the presentation. So now from the business perspective, again, management, legal, accounting, RCM, human resources, these are all changes that are extremely challenging and important. And as our groups grow, we become bigger targets. And as we become bigger targets, the necessity for this business infrastructure becomes greater. The other thing that happens is that as we develop scale, as we become larger, many of these business practices, as we discovered as we formed LUGPA practices, that there's no need to reinvent the wheel everywhere. We can go ahead and create genuine business synergies around some of these back office blocking and tackling functions, so to speak, whereby we can derive tremendous synergies as we get squeezed from our general margins, where we can go ahead and cut fat where duplicated services result in additional costs. So looking at the evolution, when we started off as solo practitioners, local small groups, and this slide is written for urology, but it really could be written for virtually any specialty. We're seeing consolidation in GI, in medical oncology, in ENT, in OBGYN. Hospital-based physicians have become very, very large groups for a large time. But so what we've seen is the evolution from solo practitioners, local small groups, into regional market leaders, which is kind of the phase that we're at right now. And we're kind of moving toward a more national vertically integrated platform. So there's an anthropological term that refers to this, and that's called limity. What limity means is you're undergoing a transformation from one state to another, but you're not fully transformed, so you're really uncomfortable in either state. So really, group practices are in that state of limity where we are big enough to be regional market players, but we're not big enough to be truly vertically integrated nationally and enjoy all the benefits that type of size entail. So private equity has become an increased option for practices. So right now we see it in many specialties. The original push was hospital-based specialists and employed physicians. So this happened in ER, this happened in radiology. Anesthesia was a big target for early PE deals. And then multiple employee groups. So for a multiple employee group means if you have a practice where you have a single or a small number of owners and a large number of employee physicians. A particular model for this is dermatology. It's very common for that. And so as that market has gone through, the intention has been now being directed to physicians at the point of service. Urology is getting a lot of attention. So is orthopedics, so is GI, so is medical oncology. These are all things that are happening. And in fact, there's an enormous amount of interest in the lending community for this. It's estimated that approximately $1 to $1.5 trillion with a T, $1 trillion is sitting on the sideline to be invested in healthcare. So there's an incredible amount of capital that is looking to get into the healthcare space because traditionally speaking, people are going to get old and people are going to get sick. So as there's volatility in different markets, people are betting that that this is going to be a fairly stable engine for growth. Now, this degree of consolidation spans practices. This is a very small map with some anesthesia, dermatology, ER, GI, OB, et cetera, down to urology. I've only listed the 3 largest platforms that exist in the United States right now in urology. But this is happening across specialties. And what I would tell you, what I would address the audience with is there's a reason for this. All these groups, all these many thousands of physicians that have signed up or partnered with a sponsor for their long-term growth, they're not doing this blindly and they're not doing it foolishly. Now, again, as we'll talk about, private equity may not be the road for everybody, but there are some very real reasons that private equity makes sense in certain markets and for certain groups. Now, to start with, this is a multi-billion-dollar, I said it's actually trillions of dollars that's there sitting on the sideline. So I'm not sure how well that broadcast, but I can barely even see it myself. But we see that there's close to 100 transactions that occurred, and people talk about the so-called exit, the second bite of the apple. Last year alone, more than 100 healthcare platforms created a rollover. And one of the things that people need to understand is there is always an exit. Private equity firms, one way or another, they don't stay in investments forever. Now, their degree of hold varies, but private equity firms will always exit an investment. If it's successful, they will exit to realize their gains because a private equity firm doesn't realize gains until the exit occurs, typically. And if it's not successful, they're going to want to exit and usually sell it back to the existing practice, although that fortunately doesn't happen terribly often. Just this month, there were 3 practices that exited, 2 OBGYN practices and an ophthalmology practice that did very well on their investments. So there's a lot of money coming into private equity. There's a lot of money in second transactions in private equity. But one of the mistakes, and this is really where we get to the meat and potatoes, is all private equity transactions are not the same. Private equity is a whole range of investment strategies that on the far extreme on one side is venture capital. So venture capital typically invests in pre-revenue companies, and they're looking to, and they'll make dozens and dozens of bets for very large capture. On the far other end is that folks that buy distressed properties and try to rehabilitate them. And in the middle, you have growth companies. So growth companies are what most private equity transactions in healthcare are doing, which is to buy companies that are already revenue positive and try to enhance them. Now, different private equity companies, different sponsors have completely different strategies on how to do that. Some people are looking to buy and accrete practices, accrete EBITDA in a very rapid in a very rapid fashion, without making a lot of structural changes to affect a rapid exit. Well, there are others that are looking to be more long-term investors and create structurally stronger businesses, hold for longer, for hopefully for them greater return. And the analogy that I could give is people that buy real estate. So if you are buying a house with the intent of flipping it, you're not going to put as much into it, but you're going to expect to get less return. If you're going to buy a house and completely renovate it and make it something that you might want to live in, you're going to spend more money and time doing it. And it's not charity. You're hoping that at the end of the day, your time value of money becomes that much greater. So this is a question that physicians don't typically ask, is to understand what is the historical investment strategy of the sponsor. So that's very important. The second thing that people do is we call it multiple derangement syndrome. We say that the PE companies have spreadsheet derangement syndrome, that the doctors get multiple derangement syndrome. And everybody is focused on what the upfront multiple is. And I will tell you flat out, it is the least important thing in a transaction. As I'll show you on the next slide, it's virtually impossible to not derive economic advantage from taking future earnings upfront in a tax preferred fashion. What we see is too little attention to life after deal. You know, you're going to be with a partner, you're selling the practice to a certain degree, and it's very important that the life after deal, not the upfront money, but the life after deal be the focus of any evaluation for a PE transaction. So this is a typical transaction that occurs. The blue line is a group that does a PE transaction. The orange line is somebody that doesn't. And this is a very nominal bit of return. So this is saying you go ahead and sell 30%, 25% of your practice at a 9x multiple. You get an exit multiple of 3, which is very conservative. And I don't want to get bogged down in details, be happy to address that during the questions, and you invest the proceeds. So even assuming that you never have a cut in your professional revenue, in other words, that your professional income doesn't drop by $1, which is a pretty big stretch, your time to break even is actually over 27 years. So for most people, that is really the entire length of their professional careers. And of course, during questions, we can address strategies to make this worthwhile for people who are coming in later, because you have to make sure that there's ownership going on. So again, it's very important to ask the right questions. There's too much attention to a perceived loss of control. A solo practitioner is 100% independent, but they have scale. And so you're subject to market vagaries. You know, when we formed our group, one of my partner's wives, who was the office manager, said, "Oh, well, we're completely independent." And I said, "Well, who's your biggest payer?" And she said, "Oxford." I said, "So what happens if next day, tomorrow you get a letter from Oxford that you're dropped? How independent are you?" And, she turned white. She never even thought that something like that could happen. Same thing's true in a 30-person group. You have independence, you have some degree of scale, but your independence is diluted by 1/30 by the board. We need to think of independence in a new way. And what I would put it to you is that independence is equivalent to equity. So what's the pros of a PE deal? You achieve scale without reinventing the wheel. You get an initial sale of a practice, which gives you liquidity, which gives you the opportunity for retirement planning, to go ahead and have money aside for your mortgage, for your kid's school. You have rollover equity, which enables you to grow the business in a synergistic fashion with your PE partner, and you have access to essentially unlimited capital and expertise. By forming very big pools, you are creating meaningful big data, and all these things are highly important. The cons is this perceived loss of independence. And of course, if you sell future earnings, you have to manage your cash flow. One thing that I would be remiss in not mentioning is think about how executives at major Fortune 500 companies earn. They focus not on their compensation, because compensation is income. Income does not translate into wealth. It's not important what you earn, it's important what you keep. And that is a very important point here. If you think about how these highly compensated executives make money, they make money largely on their stock options and deferred revenue. And a private equity transaction is a realignment of our thinking as clinicians, so we realize income the same way. So the long and short of it is, and I know I'm a little bit over time, it's very important to look at this carefully. You must pick the right partner and understand their vision and strategy to make sure it's aligned with you. It's very unwise to not look at this carefully, and it's critical for us to be educated on it. So in summary, it's not the future for everybody, but I can assure you that private equity is most definitely not a fad. Well,
thanks, Dr. Kapoor. And these were some great points and great slides. And being here from the South, I have the opportunity, and I'm very honored to be on the LUGPA board, and appreciate the opportunity to present the fad side of this argument. But being from Arkansas, the one thing I have to do is, I'm about to tell my side of the story. I have to start off with some sweet tea. And let me pour a glass and set it aside, because I'm going to try to be quick and wet my whistle a little bit before we get started. So I'm going to go through my slides, and I'm going to start off with what exactly is a fad. So the definition of a fad is an intense and widely shared enthusiasm for something, especially one that is short-lived and without a basis in the object qualities or a craze. So I'm a late-in baby boomer. So for me, fads were like hula hoops and yo-yos. I mean, I think some of our millennial attendees or Gen Z attendees might think of Cabbage Patch dolls or jelly shoes. But these are things that come into existence, are very popular at the time, and then kind of lose their glitter. In healthcare, we've seen a lot of that. And I'm gonna walk you through what I call the waves of disruption in healthcare. You look at HMOs or PPPs or PCMH, which some of these still exist. They just don't have quite the same glit and glamour that they used to. So when I kind of created a little history around what I call the waves of healthcare disruption. I've been in healthcare for about 25 years, and I've experienced every one of these waves, and I've rode those and crested. In a lot of cases, if you stay on those waves too long, you're going to crash. So at the bottom of this slide, what you see is kind of some presidential legislative impacts around healthcare. So if you look at in 65, you have the Social Security Act, which was signed by President Johnson, which really created the Medicare program. In the 70s, President Nixon advocated for the HMO Act, which ultimately stifled choice and has been highly panned as too restrictive. In the 80s, President Reagan signed the COBRA, which is the Consolidated Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, which had a lot of redeeming qualities and certainly being praised for displacing employees. In the 90s, you had the real failure and disaster of Hillary Care, which was managed care. But later on, President Clinton signed HIPAA into law, which, as we know, brought PHI into our healthcare lexicon. Going into the 2000s, from a legislative standpoint, you saw over its 38-year history, probably the largest overhaul of Medicare with President Bush signing the Medicare Prescription Drug and Improvement and Modernization Act. And most recently, and one that we are faced with and dealing with now, is what's commonly called as Obamacare, which is the Patient Protection and Accountable Care Act of 2010. So we've definitely seen the legislative side of presidents trying to impact the quality and cost of healthcare in this country. But on top of that, what we saw was the markets and private industry getting in the middle of that. So in the 80s, you had these HMOs, which looked at trying to rein in costs, and my moniker for that was choice over mandates. And basically, there was a rebellion against HMOs because patients really want three things: they want access, they want lower cost, and they want to be able to have choice. And those are three great options. So we saw really a rise of HMOs, and while some still exist, they're still certainly not as popular as they used to be. In the 90s, we talked a little bit about Hillary Care, and that was a failed experiment of politics over choice, where we were trying to take HMO and modify that into managed care. And while some managed care still exists, it certainly favors a lack of choice, one of the three things that patients really want in terms of healthcare. In the 90s, we saw the rise and fall of PPMCs, the physician practice management companies. I actually was employed with a five-core company in the late 80s, so I got to experience that rise and ultimate fall. And the moniker I give to that wave was overpromise and underdeliver. And I don't want to touch on some of the talking points around why I think that was a failure. And in the 2000s beyond, and something we're sitting here talking about, is really what is the rise and I think maybe eventual fall of private equity, where that moniker is profit over purpose. And so what is it that we're trying to accomplish? And I want to give you my side of that argument. So to get some historical and perspective in the urology world, I put together this slide. Just look at what has happened in private equity in the urology space. There's really five major platforms that have arisen in the last 4 years in the urology space. We've seen United Urology, Urology Management Associates, US Urology, Solaris, and Gage Capital. So that first foray into private equity world was when Audex and Chesapeake joined and created United Urology. And what you can see here is this history, and these are color-coded to show you all the transactions that United had, that United Urology Management Associates had. And most recently, we've had Solaris come into the market in 2020 with IMP and a TUG in Cincinnati. Gage Capital is a fairly new one with Urology America is their name with the merger and acquisition of Urology Austin. So I know that in speaking with a lot of these, and we certainly don't put our head in the sand, we want to understand what is the value. There are more acquisitions that I know are coming, and as Dr. Kapoor said earlier, there are certainly valid reasons why people are going that route. And so my intent is not to cast aspersions on the decisions. There are a lot of groups that don't see the value on it, and I want to present that side. So one of the other things is last year in November, everybody got introduced to Jimmy Bob and his family, and I did a nice fun video around private equity and kind of my view of it from an Arkansas perspective. And one of the things we talked about was this penetration of private equity in LUGPA. As it stands right now, and this may not include Associated Medical Professionals in the numbers, which is the most recent announcement, only about 12% of the membership in LUGPA are doctors in private equity. It's probably a little bit higher now. I do believe that number will go up. I think more groups will certainly look at private equity. The one thing that is important to understand, and I know Dr. Henderson will definitely address this issue a little bit later, is does this really have an impact? These are dues-paying members. We all have a same common mission, and that's to provide outstanding, cutting-edge quality care to our urological patients. So I certainly don't have an issue or concern about private equity and penetration into LUGPA. So let me walk through a couple of my talking points. I think one of the things that definitely hits me in terms of a fad is that we've been in private equity in the urology space for 4 years, and we still haven't seen that second bite. And while it isn't necessarily, the benchmark that we're looking for, it certainly is one of the things that private equity talks about in terms of a recurring financial return within that space. So, Audex and Chesapeake, which is United Urology, has been in the marketplace for 4 years. They've scaled up. They do have a reach across the country. We haven't seen that. I do know that there are other groups that are in discussions with all of these platforms. But for me, when we talk about other specialties that have benefited from the private equity space, and we've seen those second bites and we've seen those returns, because if truly what this is a a model based on financial security, then we certainly should have seen some type of second bite, at least by now. And maybe there is one that's pending and we're not aware of. I think the second thing is that the similarities between the PPMCs of the 90s and PE, it's very uncanny. I think it's a different spin, and I think it's a shinier package. But if you think about what PPMCs offered, and I was an employee with FICOR, they talked about MSO consolidation, and MSO is quite frankly in quotations, because I'm not sure that they really give you those things that we talked about, management expertise and efficiency in certain things. I mean, really the value in a lot of practices is the local management and the local physician presence. Now, that's not true in all cases, but I haven't seen that come of fruition. Improved management, purchasing economies, protection on reimbursement, contract leveraging. That was one of the things that FICOR promised quite vehemently, which they were never able to deliver on. Now, that's different. It was a multi-specialty group practice, and it was a different range. So certainly understand that within the urology space, there is some value and potential opportunity there. The other thing I said, once the luster fades and money is spent, I think physicians will realize that they are employees. And this is an issue I brought up before. They are not owners, and they do not get to make all the decisions. And I love this analogy and this phrase: employees can make a company great, but owners make great companies. And the difference between an owner and employee is the mindset. You're an owner versus a renter. And to Dr. Kapoor's point, I mean, yes, you are a stockholder, and you definitely want to rebuild your house, but I like the analogy of how you treat a rental car versus owning your own car. I've never hand washed a rental car, and I definitely, because the relationship is truly transactional at that point. And so I think there is a different mindset, and that's what I talked about last November, and I don't think that any of that has changed. LUGPA and UroGPO currently provide scale for a lot of these things that PE talks about that they can do, which is legislative support or contracting, purchasing, educational pathways. And so essentially PE may not necessarily be required for these practice improvement strategies. LUGPA has political advocacy, clinical education, colleague forums, national meetings. UroGPO and others provide in-office dispensing, drug rebates, and contracting, pathway education. I think a lot of groups, maybe they don't have scale and they can't do these things, but those resources are available to those practices. I think the other thing that, has been talked around PE is removing the administrative burden from those physicians. One of the things that happens in this type of PE model is that you have to create EBITDA by reducing salary. And that creates a clawback effect. And so when you look at burnout, urologists are ranked at 54%, according to this national burnout and suicide report in 2020. 50% of urologists state that they would take a pay cut to have a better work-life balance. That, health systems compared to private practice have a different burnout rate. And so really, I believe that the reduction in salary alone creates a level of anxiety and a desire to work harder, because I think physicians, as Dr. Kapoor mentioned, they're in this limity state. And so if they're there, they're still stuck between fee for service and I have to spin the wheel faster to make up my salary versus moving to pay for performance. And I think that change in of itself and the change management creates part of that conflict and that stress for physicians. So a couple last quick points under my talking points are just the cost of capital is very high. I mean, you start with most PE groups are looking to 15 to 20% returns. When you look at the cost of capital right now, crime rate is 3.25, and that could certainly go up with a change in administration. Federal discount rates, 25 basis points. I mean, it's down 200 basis points from a year ago. So money is cheap, and traditional bank loans, and some of them do have personal or corporate guarantees tied to them, is relatively low as well. And the last point I want to make is that have groups actually studied alternatives to private equity or noticed what's happening in the employment trends. So definitely bank financing is less expensive. Private wealth, family wealth investors, and there are plenty of those around. They usually look for lower and longer returns, but perhaps lower multiples. And certainly we don't want to get stuck in a multiple derangement syndrome. consolidation options without immediate liquidity events. And I think what you have to look at is, what is the true value of your practice? Have you looked at the balance sheet to determine what value your clinic and your practice has? I worked in the health system sector at a local hospital or a regional hospital, and that's one of the things we looked at to be able to achieve the EBITDA that we needed. Looking at hospitals' partnerships instead of acquisitions, PSAs, professional service agreements, support agreements, service lines management agreements, medical directorships, foundation models. And I think lastly, there's so much going on in reimbursement landscape with 340B pricing, most favored nation, price transparency, provider-based billing reimbursement changes, and site neutrality payments. And I think those are going to affect hospital employment, and I think create opportunities for private groups to potentially snap up these urologists that are out there. So I know that some of you that were here last year are wondering what's happened with Jimmy Bob. I do want y'all to know that he still can't afford to buy himself back. He is definitely slipped into fits of depression, and his hunting dog Bo can't even cheer him up. Hunting during COVID isn't very fun. And y'all probably all heard of PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. But strangely, Jimmy Bob has got actually TDS, which is post-transaction depression syndrome. And while there's been extensive research, there really hasn't been a vaccine or cure developed. And I'm sure a lot of you were wondering what was going on with Jimmy Bob and the farm and the family in Arkansas. So that's a quick update. Lastly, I know my time is running short. I think the questions that physicians have to ask themselves, or these groups have to ask themselves, is why do you need the cash? Why do you need to do PE? Is it a liquidity event? Is it to buy out retiring partners? Is it growth funding? Is it security? I think that's a very important question to ask. What's your average age of your partners? Do you have the manpower to sustain that 10 to 15% growth year over year? Because you're going to have to pay quite a big return in equity funding. Again, inability to compete with the hospitals or to get new recruits. So looking at different models there. Physicians unwilling to absorb personal debt or liability. Because that certainly is one of the values in PE, is that you don't necessarily have a lot of recourse there, although you may lose stock value if it doesn't perform the way it should. So lastly, here in summary, groups have many available resources for efficiency and cost reductions. I've covered some of those. Again, the cost of private equity or for liquidity or growth events is very expensive. I think the loss of control isn't just decision-making. It's becoming an employee changes your mindset and outlook. There are alternatives to private equity that people should explore. And lastly, reimbursement changes for health systems and hospitals will change the employment models. So in that background, I want to leave talking about Sisyphus. And for those of you that know Greek mythology, Sisyphus was a crafty devil that snubbed his nose at Zeus and eventually got sent down to Hades. And as punishment for his trickery and cheating death, he was forced to roll a boulder up a hill constantly. And as he got to the top of the hill, it constantly rolled down. He had to keep starting over and over into eternity. In some ways, what we're looking at, and what I believe, is that this Sisyphus effect is happening. We're working harder, but we're not necessarily seeing the impact that we're trying to get to. So with that, I'm going to open that up for questions. I know Dr. Henderson, Dr. Henderson's up next, so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Henderson.
Great. Thank you, Scott. And I'm impressed at the knowledge of Greek mythology. That's a good new spin on these things. You guys have both been great, and I appreciate everything that you've said. And it's a great follow-up to last year's conversation, Scott, that you had with Victor Houtz, with even more information. But the question is still here, I think, in front of us, that, is this the future? Is this a natural evolutionary process, or is this just a fad? And to make up our mind on that, I agree with the approach both of you took to some degree, and I'll go back through that. And that's to look a little bit historically to see how we got here. Is this a natural evolutionary process? Our specialty started about 100 years ago. Urology started in the South. And because of that, it was well penetrated in the South. And in the 1950s, even, it was not unusual to see relatively large urology groups of 4 or 5 men throughout the South. The economies of scale that were realized at that time, and other economic forces started multi-specialty clinics across our country. Patients could receive more treatment in one location. The overhead was lower. Income for the physicians could be augmented. And so urology groups watched these and realized that multi-specialty clinics had some pluses, but urologists could go out and basically form their own single specialty group that could compete with those, because like Dr. Kapoor frequently says, our specialty is a cul-de-sac specialty. We have that dead-end street where the patient comes to us and we keep it. So as urology groups then grew and started to incorporate some of those multi-specialty type practices, like Scott said, along came the MSOs of the 1990s. They made a foray into urology in a strong way around 1996, I think. And there are promises of easier practice for the physician. There's less attention to having to run in the practice. Management was taken care of for you. Contracting at a scale, acquiring supplies at economy. The problem is none of this really worked out. Scott covered it well. That was an evolutionary dead end. That was sort of a dodo bird. But there were still some lessons to be learned there, and urology groups took note, integrated some of these concepts that were good with the MSOs into their larger groups. And the next thing that you see emerge on the scene are LUGPA groups. You had large, fully integrated LUGPA groups. You had sophisticated business models running basically a miniature single specialty academic type practice with care rivaling that given anywhere in the world, but moreover with a business model that had not been seen in medicine. And that's what LUGPA really turned things on its head doing. And the evolution then goes down to, unfortunately, site of service non-neutrality. As Dr. Kapoor has worked long and hard in DC to help fight, CMS, through a long list of reasons, has decided to give the hospital some extra money. And that created predatory hospital practices. And that led to acquisitions and put pressure on groups financially. And just so happens at the same time, we had tremendous problems in the urology workforce with an undersupply of urologists, an oversupply of patients, and an aging, burnt out workforce. And on that note, I do want to thank Scott for pointing out that the burnout is something that does have to play into the conversation. The problem is, though, with all those coming together right then, it leads to struggles with our traditional LUGPA practice model. So it is time for some form of disruption. There's no doubt about that. But is this the answer? That's the question we're trying to figure out. Some disruptive technology is ugly. Some of it is just downright an evolutionary dead end. Is private equity a platypus, or is it something else? The point here, though, that I need to address, as Scott asked me to, is that private equity is currently a new model under expansion and is completely acceptable with and compatible with LUGPA. I have had a number of people question, is a group undergoing private equity really suited to be in LUGPA still? Of course. Our groups come in all sizes. We have different mission statements, vision statements, different financing models, different billing models, different ownership models. And this is just another one. So I do want to just right off the bat say, private equity in no way contradicts the LUGPA mission. It totally can align with LUGPA. So let's just get that out of the way right now. The thing is this. The way I see it, the networking that was foundational for LUGPA is a good example. For over a decade, LUGPA had our meetings. We've come together, we've shared ideas. Just as iron sharpens iron, we've torn some ideas apart. We've improved some ideas together. We've integrated some ideas. We've stolen some ideas from each other. This is exactly what's going to happen as we move down this path. Our business models today will not be the business models for tomorrow. There is certainty that private equity will interact in some alchemical way to provide us with future options to help boost up our ability to maintain the independent practice of urology. The past decade has been really exciting in urology, scientifically at least. There have been world-changing breakthroughs in every treat, such as prostate cancer, but among all the diseases we treat. LUGPA itself was similarly revolutionary. And I'm excited right now to see that the well of creativity is still deep and flowing. I don't have an answer to the question whether or not this is future or fad, but I do know that in some way, this question will help provide us the LUGPA of tomorrow. And I'd like to thank Dr. Shore for the opportunity to participate in today's panel.
Awesome. Thank you, gentlemen. We have about 15 minutes, a little bit less. We've gotten some great questions from the audience. Let me start with this one. Please keep your answers to 30 seconds if everyone wants to respond. So here's a good question. How are the current private equity groups integrating newer and non-partner urologists? If they don't get a significant bite of the apple at the first or second iteration, aren't they signing up for an employed model not too much different from being owned by a hospital, essentially commoditized? What incentivizes the new generation to join these urology-based private equity models? Let me have you answer it first, Deepak. Keep it to 30 seconds, then Scott, and then Jonathan, if you would like as well.
Yeah, certainly. That's a great question. And it really is important because if you're going to have in any practice, whether it be one that's backed by a private equity group or one that is just an independent group on your own, it's important that you go ahead and generate your enthusiasm and commitment from your young talent, because otherwise, the incoming residents and fellows that are joining our practices are our futures, both economically, and they're our future leaders. So you have to have a mechanism to engage them. There's multiple different ways of doing it, and without speaking out of school, but I have a lot of familiarity on the approach that we're taking, but it can be via recycling equity that previous groups have. It could be via things that are known as profits interest. It could be by the issuance of new shares and a systematic dilution out of then fair market value. But I will say that not all private equity backed ventures allow for this. And this is a very, very important question. And one of the critical things when we consider private equity, we spent a lot of time on this. And it was, for us, what we consider and I'm not saying that we're the only ones in the space that are doing it, but it's critically important. And there are multiple different vehicles to accomplish this.
Okay. Scott, your thoughts?
Well, I definitely think remaining independent and not joining PE gives you other opportunities. I mean, you start thinking about recruiting young physicians, you got to be different from what a hospital health system models offer, which is simply, comp per RVU models. When you're in private practice and you have ownership in your buildings, and I certainly recognize certain states have certificate needs, and so it doesn't allow for ownership in surgery centers or other ventures. But the states that do have that have the opportunity to create wealth. I've talked a lot about the three stools that we have at Arkansas Urology. My job is to maintain income, W-2, create wealth, and create a quality of life for our physicians. I think remaining independent gives us the ability to do those. Certainly in PE structures, you can exclude certain aspects of the wealth generation in a practice, but I think it definitely diminishes the PE and multiple value of that practice.
So, Deepak,
respectfully,
Deepak, let me ask you this. I really want to. So, without Nate, this is a competitive world, and I get it. Scott showed a beautiful slide of 5 distinct companies that have platforms. There's probably going to be more to come. But for our colleagues who are listening, and again, please, 30 seconds, what are the questions that someone would want to ask that differentiate one platform from another without naming the names of a company?
The most important thing, as I said, is life after deal. The upfront economics for most of these transactions are fairly similar, where you are taking a certain amount of your revenue and you are selling it in a tax advantage fashion against future earnings. So that's pretty similar across the board. You know, you could talk about the multiple, this, that. Those are really stepping over dollars to pick up nickels, as far as I'm concerned. What you really want to talk about is life after deal. And one of the things that I have to respectfully disagree with Scott on is the notion that PE and independence are mutually exclusive, because fundamentally, I have to just fundamentally disagree with that. You know, think about a PE company, and I'll wrap it up really quick, Neil, as an administrator. You're going to be with a PE sponsor for a finite period of time. You're going to be with your partners for the balance of your professional career. It's like when you go to a hospital. The administrator is there for 3 years, 4 years, then you have the next hospital administrator, but you're still practicing at that hospital. Private equity is a vehicle to retain independence, not an alternative to independence. And so the critical thing, as I said, is making sure you understand the governance structure and the authorities of the practice after the transaction, life after deal.
So any response to that, please, Scott? And then I have a question for Jonathan, if he's still on. I know he had another important commitment, but Scott?
Yeah, I respectfully disagree with his disagreement. I definitely think that when you start looking at independence, I don't necessarily, and I meant to cover this in some of my slides, and unfortunately I had several people text me that I wasn't on video, so I apologize for that. Deke is much better looking than I am, so I wanted y'all to focus on my slides rather than me. But you know, when you start talking about what is independence, what I did want to say is, look, physicians do, in just about all these PE structures, still going to maintain clinical autonomy, which they have to. I don't think any PE is going to get into deciding how to treat patients. But what we're talking about is independent practices that really have control over their dollars. Can they buy things? I mean, yeah, they're in part of a board, and yes, they have the ability to have influence on that. But ultimately, as I quoted last year at LUGPA in Chicago, somebody's got a daddy. Someone's going to ultimately make that decision, and it's not going to be the doctors. So we can say we're independent clinically, but from a business perspective, ultimately someone else other than the doctors makes those decisions. And so I think that's where I think it's the definition of independence is where maybe we disagree.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my response to that.
Great dialogue. Jonathan, I know you want to comment on where are, new graduating residents and fellows, where are they going to go? Are they going to join LUGPA? Are they going to go get employed hospital, academic, non-academic, for-profit, not-for-profit, or go into a private equity group? I know you want to comment on that. And then I wanted to just ask you one other question that popped up in the Q&A. This the whole notion of the second bite of the apple is, generating EBITDA, right? And so if you can cut down on your expenses, are you convinced that a large group that has really significant scale, 100, 200 doctors, might just say, you know what, this year we're not going to pay our dues because it's pretty significant money? So those two questions for you, Jonathan.
Yeah, well, two good questions. Thank you, Neil. For the new urologist, that's a big concern, and I respectfully would like to say that neither of my colleagues really answered that. Deke threw out a bunch of ways that you could attract somebody to a private equity aligned group, but the problem is what we're seeing. You all know this, is that with our current much simpler practice models, new graduates are not that interested in joining. They're, for the first time ever, the census shows that hospital-employed physicians are the majority of physicians in the country. So I have yet to see anyone who can tell me or show me how private equity does anything to help attract the mindset of the millennial and the generation after millennials to our form of independent practice. That is a concern of mine. You know, we all obviously value the independence of urology, but does the next generation? And if not, how do we create that? We can't. That's a natural thing. That's something that we can't truly create. So it's a very big concern.
So we've got 5 minutes left. What I'd like to do is allow Deepak to pose a hard-hitting question. Remember, this is Crossfire, gentlemen. A hard-hitting question to Scott and vice versa. Scott, you pose a hard-hitting question to Deepak, and we'll let Jonathan adjudicate on the responses. So we'll start with you first, Deepak.
So I think that I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in the dialogue. There are, we're short on time, so I'll focus on the question as opposed to some of the points that I think could use refinement. But, you know, one of the things we're not seeing in our practice, nor in the practices that we're speaking to, we're seeing a lot more depression because of what's happening in the market. We're seeing doctors with a feeling of helplessness, that feeling of Sisyphus pushing up the rock. Every single doctor that I know feels like that, with EMR, with regulations, with the sense of hopelessness that doctors feel. It's not based on private equity. It's based on the reality of what we do every single day and how hard it is to slog through our days. You know, since the transaction, our doctors have been completely relieved of debt. They have economic security. We suffered. We were the first group to suffer through COVID. None of our physicians really faced any economic distress or any anxieties related to that because they were able to preserve future earnings. So Scott, I would ask you, you know, because most of that 15-20% does actually come from the exit multiple, not from organic growth. How would you answer the question for the doctors, the doctors who are every LUGPA practice, who's Sisyphus right now, that is facing their revenues go away by the stroke of a pen or legislative fiat that shuts them down? How would you address those doctors and say, where is their hope for realistic financial security absent some type of disruptive technology?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Dr. Kapoor. Let me answer it a couple of ways. I think, and I talked about the three-legged stool we use here, and not everyone has the same market conditions or the market share that we have in Arkansas. So I clearly recognize that. But I think a lot of this starts with the culture and leadership of groups. And as I came onto the board and I interviewed with Dr. Shore, one of the things I told him was I really want to focus on executive leadership. You know, one of the things that LUGPA put in place was this management training program for future leaders. And I think that's one of the things that we're bringing to bear. I think one of the, you know, if we'd had a live event this year in Chicago, we were going to have a speaker talk about culture and how we bring about that. There are certainly resources. Last year we had Dr. Scott McDermott talk about burnout and ways to create that. Now, those are all more of a mental issue as opposed to a financial issue. As I mentioned earlier in my talking points, there are resources out there. There are groups between LUGPA, UroGPO, other resources out there to help. It's not going to work for every group, and I'm going to give you that because, you know, the circumstances are different for a lot of groups. I reached out to my subset of urology colleagues that are in larger practices, and the truth is a lot of these groups didn't suffer the consequences of the financial setbacks. We are actually having a banner year this year in Arkansas, despite the rise of cases in Arkansas. So I think the short answer is, how do you address the stress? And I think you've got to have good leadership, good culture, looking at other resources to secure that financial success. I just don't believe going to PE and paying 20% equity to get that is the answer.
Okay, Jonathan, what are your thoughts? We still have you, my friend?
Yeah. I think Dr. Kapoor made some great points, and unfortunately, I'm not sure if all the three-legged people in Arkansas helps Scott to have an environment that the rest of the country doesn't have, but the rest of the country is dealing with hopelessness, and I think Deke, you really scored on that one. We have to find a way to help the Sisyphus feeling that we're all having. And you enumerated not just the way we are, but as you said, legislative fiat could change our whole future. Any day we could wake up with that. So, I definitely think there's some solace to be gained in the economic security that Dr. Kapoor speaks to. And I'm very happy for Scott that his group's doing so well, but I don't believe that's the reality for most of us.
Well, that's going to be the last word. And gentlemen, awesome, great content, great slides, great discussion. Deepak Kapoor, Jonathan Henderson, Scott Davis. I think our urology as a specialty is incredibly indebted to the hard work that you're doing and continue to do. Can't thank you enough on behalf of LUGPA, the Virtual Crossfire Series, and the folks at Platform Q. We thank the sponsors for today's program, Bayer, UroGen, and Exact Sciences. You can come back and rewatch this program and see the slides on UroCareLive.com. There are other really great sessions in the LUGPA Virtual Crossfire Series. Our next one coming up on December 16th will include some really interesting case discussions on the use of genomic testing in patients with both low and favorable intermediate risk disease. So with that, we've run out of time. We'll probably want to do another one of these programs in the future. Thank you, gentlemen, very, very much.